Hello, so this is part 3 of joint movement for healthy gait and balance. We looked at, in part 2, movements at the ankle and toes. Again, dorsiflexion, incredibly important, reinforcing toe extension, very important. Now we're going to look more at hip-related movements that are important for gait. So I'm going to stand up, off and away. So when we walk, we have this whole, and again, the gait cycle can be broken down into some pretty complex dynamics. So look at charts, look at videos, know that some of the terminology gets a little bit convoluted. But if I'm just standing, here everything's paired. Adductor is stabilizing, abductor is stabilizing. But as soon as I lift this leg, now this is open chain. Everything now has become more mobile in this right leg. This leg, now everything has to kick on and start stabilizing me and keep me from falling over. So in this initial contact phase, we're going to say, here's my heel strike, that initial contact phase. Then I have to transition. Now both feet are making contact with the ground, but my weight distribution is changing from one leg to the other, from certain parts of the foot to other parts of the foot. So this front foot, as I completely flatten and make contact with the ground, and then this initial phase, the foot is in what we call supination. And then as I strike and go into my mid stance, and it's behind me, the midfoot is more in pronation. This is why we need good strength and pliability in the arches of our feet. Now, in order to accomplish these motions, however, we can't be walking where our legs stay directly in line with our hips as when we're standing. We would walk around like robots, right? And we might see this with people that have any array of issues. Low back, hip, knee. When these structures aren't moving very well, we tend to get a little bit more robotic and have more of a shuffling kind of a gait. Or it's more one side, where one leg is either we're lifting, because we're trying to maybe limit motion at the knee. So we're using the low back and the hip to lift the leg a lot. This could just as easily be related to a foot or ankle injury or dysfunction, because limiting that, either we're having kind of that limping related gait, or any of this is the body's way of reducing the motion at the joint itself in compensating with the other side of the body, or a part of the body above or below that joint to produce the movement. So, all that being said, important that we realize what the pelvis and lumbar spine has to do to effectively allow this motion to carry one leg from behind us, around, and in front of us, as well as what the ball and socket joints of the hip joints themselves have to accomplish. Now, as a general rule, the slower you go, the wider your foot placement can be. The faster you go, the narrower and narrower our foot placement becomes. Sprinters, for example, end up running very much a heel-toe, that their gait tends to run more on a thinner line compared to if I'm just walking. Naturally, my feet can be further apart. Anyway, so how do I reinforce this good, healthy movement at the hip joint? And it's just as simple as this. Now, we covered in the part 2 video that in order for me to have an efficient gait, the big toe has to stay in line with the direction that I'm moving. Okay? So I do not want, as I do this motion, to feel my leg get turned into external rotation or internal rotation. Usually people will shift into external rotation as they try to accomplish these motions. They'll look more like this with their foot turned out, and they might even turn at their whole low back, particularly when they go behind them into this rotational pattern. They'll wing out with their whole body, at the very least at the hip. So we want to reinforce that their toes stay pointed in front of them the whole time. And we can start with this whole heel toe idea. It's heel toe, bring it back around, heel toe. And I can switch it, heel toe, heel toe. You can break this down into smaller movements if needed, in that we can start with just being able to basically get our foot in front of us and then behind us, right? This will look just like that initial one I was showing in part 2. What is by far the most important here, though, is to really get that hip rotation with AD duction, and then hip rotation with AB duction, and then again, hip rotation with AB duction. There's a whole flexion of the hip with those front 4 AD ductors that then has to flip, and then we have AB duction with our hip extensors, adductor magnus assisting with hip extension as well. So, same principle, if I needed to, bringing a chair over and on the side of the non-swinging leg, obviously, otherwise I'm going to hit it. So bringing a chair over to stabilize, and then I want, in order to create a good amount of joint play here, if I want to be able to get to where I can bring my whole foot and leg over in front of the other foot and have both big toes in line with the direction of that movement, okay? So foot past the foot, forward foot in front of back foot, and then same thing, bringing that foot back now behind me and getting it to where it's behind and past. So lateral and anterior, lateral, posterior. And this is what we want. And in the whole swing phase, trying to keep that toe forward. See how I'm really trying not to let my foot rotate, my leg rotate at the hip during any part of this. So the beginner's cycle of this would be, all right, I'm going to unlock this knee just a touch, by the way, all right? Swing and swing. That's all it is. They have to, just being able to get in front of that foot is sufficient, entirely sufficient to be able to only get to where we're just anterior and posterior of the balancing leg. But if we can get past that, much better. And switch. Get myself here, and here we go. So just a nice easy hip rotation, making sure my spine is fixed, and I'm trying to focus this movement at the ball and socket joint of the hip while restraining that rotational pattern. So I'm thinking mostly about flexion, adduction, extension, abduction, flexion, adduction, abduction, flexion, adduction. Less about rotation. Okay? Now the advanced version of that is to bring the arms in. And this is where in the next one, we'll cycle into the idea of bringing the upper body into some of these balancing components. But the advanced option of this is doing the same leg swing with the oppositional arm movement. So right leg going forward, left arm going forward. Now what I'm getting is not just the mobility element of the swinging leg, but this leg, the balancing leg, is being really challenged. All those muscles are having to change the way that they're isometrically contracting because my weight distribution is changing related to this leg being in front of me or behind me. And this is just a great way to exaggerate what our body has to accomplish every time we walk or run. And then switch. Keeping the foot obviously in dorsiflexion. I can't accomplish this if I'm in plantar flexion. I mean, you could, it's not going to reinforce anything that we're looking for. When we're in the swing phase, ankle has to be dorsiflex, all right? Be careful in how you do this kind of stuff. I've seen people do this more on stools so that they can get more of a hip drop, but just always be cautious. Do not fall over. Better off starting with holding on to something like that chair until you're really confident. So you see, I'm just bringing in that arm swing with it as well. So nothing too crazy, but you can see doing some good dorsiflexion, mobility at the toes, dorsiflexion at the ankles, and then reinforcing this hip rotation movement is the best advice I have for you. This one in particular just accomplishes so much because I have to, it challenges me to strengthen all the balancing components of the static leg, as well as the mobility of the hip, of the swinging leg. With that, however, though, we do need to make sure we keep in mind that the pelvis, when we walk, needs to be able to hike up on one side and drop on the other side. And then as we rotate forward and then land on that leg, it needs to flip. Other side needs to hike up while this side drops down. This is what our pelvis needs to be doing, and our lumbar spine is then also laterally flexing and rotating. So the lumbar spine and the pelvis need to do this figure 8 pattern of elevating and depressing, hiking up, dropping down, rotating, and then there is, of course, an anterior and posterior tilt element as well. The easiest one I have for that is get your hands on the top of the ilium, right on the top of the pelvis, and you can break these motions down into anterior, posterior. So anterior tilt, posterior tilt. With this, I can challenge myself to feel my obliques kicking on and my glutes kicking on. Lateral flexions, a hip hike on one side, hip hike, hip drop, hip hike and drop. But I could just do big circles, right? Just getting my hands there to help reinforce that motion. And if I'm looking in a mirror, for example, I can see, am I getting as high on one side as I am on the other? We all have some innate asymmetry, but challenging the asymmetry helps a lot. And just playing with this idea of more of this, more of the rotations, all of that. This all leads into what I spoke about related to the obliques and the glutes. This stance of getting our lumbar spine out of extension and into a more flexed and flattened position really helps engage the obliques and glutes, particularly related to postural stability. This is seen in like a Tai Chi stance, right? So knees unlocked. So knees slightly flexed, hips slightly flexed, feeling my low back, really curling my hips underneath of me, feeling glute maximus fire and the obliques fire. That all by itself is a really great exercise for the postural core stability. And then with that, I can include all those movements at the feet and toes, and then shift out of that, move into my hip rotation stuff. Just doing this in any kind of pattern I can think of. I tend to work from the feet up, but reinforcing, hey, toes, ankles, especially dorsiflexion, hip rotation with balancing. You can't go wrong. So, have fun, stay safe, read your textbooks.